Good morning. I am just so in awe of everything I've heard this morning. You do not need a sermon. It's just amazing. The diversity, the depth, the breadth is just, I'm just profoundly awed. So it's a real honor to be here with you this morning and to join with you in thinking about what happens when we worship. Now, what I will be focusing on is what happens. We've heard a lot about our individual expressions and manifestations and experiences of worship, but what I want to talk a little bit about today is what happens when we worship together as a community. As Jennifer noted in that just those beautiful welcoming words, that even to define worship is really a challenge. It's so different for everybody. And the fact that it's so often associated with religion sometimes makes it problematic. It narrows the meaning of worship. As we've heard, it is so broad what the possibilities are. In broad strokes, I think of worship for myself as how I relate to what gives meaning to life. And perhaps it is worship when we focus on what inspires us, draws some kind of loyalty. Perhaps it's worship when reverence and gratitude and a sense of connection with life with a capital L are evoked in the course of a worship service. And perhaps worship is what lures us into action in the world in the service of justice and peace and loving kindness. So, as you've already been invited, I'll invite you again to just reflect on what it is that is worship for you when we gather together in worship. Now, I want to begin with a couple of verses from the book of Genesis, and recognizing this is spoiler alert, there's explicit God language in the passage, and we know that it doesn't work for everyone. But one of the things when Jennifer and I conferred earlier this week, that we noticed that we all go through a process of some kind of internal translation as we're listening. The metaphors don't work and our minds begin to generate information and we come up with what does work in place of it. So I invite you to go ahead and do those mental gymnastics in order to make your own meaning from this ancient story. The story of Jacob is, it's a curious one because it's a story of brothers and it's a story of betrayal. Jacob is a usurper. He takes his brother's birthright. He takes the blessing from the father, disguises himself as his brother so that he gets all the rights of the firstborn, even though he was not the firstborn. So the part of the story that I want to cite, he's on the run. His brother, whom he has betrayed, has threatened to kill him. So he takes off and he's on his journey. So hear this from the book of Genesis. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and he stayed there for the night because the sun had set, and he took one of the stones of the place and he put it under his head and he lay down in that place and he dreamed. He dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching into the heavens, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I'm the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and all the families of earth shall be blessed in you and your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely God is present in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid. And he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And so he rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it, and he called that place Bethel. Solitary moments have the potential to be filled with awareness and insight. When we're open and seeking, we each eventually may come to our own experience of the holy, however we choose to name it or refuse to name it. We've heard from Dory and Ursula and Janie and Norm how rich and diverse our individual ways of experiencing and naming the transcendent can be. And our individual words and ways of seeking and acknowledging and naming the holy, our ways of encountering and worshiping on our own are innumerable. But the very existence of this community of Unitarian Universalists attests to the fact that our individual experience of the transcendent is not all there is. There's something in us that wants to be in the company of others in a corporate experience of the holy. I think it has probably been that way since the beginning of the human experiment. So it might be well to entertain notions of what happens to us when we worship together. What draws us back week after week for worship in the sanctuary, whether literal or on Zoom? And I've been thinking about this a lot over the last year, partly because some of the experiences I have had in Zoom worship. In the face of the enormity of loss and uncertainty that we live with these days as we move through the pandemic, as we move through economic distress, as we find our way through political division, there's a real need to be together for experiences of corporate worship. One of the things that has been made much of during the pandemic is the isolation and the solitariness that the pandemic has caused. We're social animals, and our sense of self and our well-being is woven into our circles of relationship, into our interdependence with one another. We kind of need to be with our tribe, where we feel known and cared for and loved and respected and understood, even if we don't all think the same way or see eye to eye. There's a reason why solitary confinement and isolation are used in prisons to break down hostile resistance and control behavior. Solitariness affects our minds and spirits in negative ways if it goes on too long or if it's not our choice. When we worship together, that sense of separateness and isolation is mitigated, even if we're only meeting via Zoom. We regain the sense that we are part of something larger than ourselves, as so many of you have already affirmed. The larger frame may be simply that we are a vital part of a community, but that larger frame can also be grand enough to shape our understanding of who we are in the universe. So what happens to us when we worship together? Most of what I have to say, you already know, but I think it's worth raising it to our collective mind again in order to appreciate it more fully. Something begins to happen as soon as we begin to gather in sacred space, whether it's real or it's virtual. The energy in the room or the Zoom room begins to build as the worshiping community gathers. Each spirit, by its arrival, raises the level of enjoyment of the rest as it joins those already present. I have experienced this as true in the 15 or 20 minutes before the start of service when we are in Stephen's Chapel on a Sunday morning. And if we pay attention, it is equally true as each face joins the Zoom screen in virtual sacred space. Together, we create something sacred that does not exist in the same way when we are apart. With the ritual of lighting the chalice, there's a noticeable shift in focus and energy as we mark the border between ordinary time and sacred time. The energy in the congregation goes through a subtle kind of settling as we draw our attention toward sacred meaning and we enter the time of worship. Together, we enter a paradox of a kind of inwardness while we are in one another's company. So for nearly a full year now, if you can believe it, a full year, we have not been able to be together in person for worship. And yet we really have been very much together in our Zoom sanctuary. One very real and noticeable difference, and I think a very real blessing, is that we are not seated in formal rows, staring at the backs of each other's heads. If we revisit the ancient story of Jacob, there is another episode where Jacob and his estranged brother are reunited after many years. There is both wondering and fear on Jacob's part about how the brother he deceived will receive him. He has already sent whole flocks of sheep and herds of goats and camels and cattle on ahead as gifts to his brother Esau in effort to appease him, to kind of smooth the way, just in case. And then they finally come into each other's presence. And Esau, the brother who has been deceived, wants to know, what is the meaning of all these gifts? And Jacob answers, and I'm quoting, "They're to find favor with you." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." And Jacob said, "No, I pray you, if you would do me this favor, accept from me this gift. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, and you have received me favorably." After years and years of not really seeing one another, the brothers meet face to face, and something happens to Jacob. He looks upon his brother's face, not in fear and trepidation, but in an awakened state. In such a state that he expresses lavishly, "For to see your face is like seeing the face of God." One of the gifts of the pandemic is the experience of Zoom worship that permits us to worship with one another face to face and to enjoy the myriad expressions of the holy that we may see in one another's faces in the context of worship. As I gaze into our Zoom sanctuary, it is a powerful and lovely thing to be able to see each of you face to face and to see something of the divine in our time together. So for a moment, if you have the ability to choose between speaker view and gallery view on your device, I want to invite you to switch to gallery view so that you can see everyone's faces. And for a few moments, I invite you to scan the faces on your screen. Pause for each one. See each familiar face. Really see one another. And perhaps in the process of doing this, you can breathe a silent message of a gift of peace, a gift of healing, a gift of loving kindness. I'd like for us to do this in silence for just a few moments. Just pause and to scan your screen, looking at each face, offering a gift of love, compassion, peace. Don't forget, there's a couple of pages. And then just recall these slightly modified words from Jacob again. Accept this gift of peace, of loving kindness, of healing, whatever the gift may be. Accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God. When we encounter one another in the context of worship, we may see one another differently, as though encountering something greater in each one, perhaps even in ourselves. And when we carry this expanded awareness with us back into ordinary time, something has changed. And we may actually see the world differently because we encountered one another in worship. The ritual of sharing our joys and concerns can be a crucial part of our common worship, especially as we come through a year like no other in our life together. We come to know one another in deeply compassionate ways as we share parts of our lives where we may need support. Grief and mourning are softened and made more bearable in each other's company. Celebrations are deepened and enjoyed even more when we share them with one another. This too is something that happens to us when we worship together. Our lives are cushioned with caring when we need it, and our lives are made larger when we celebrate together. A final thing I have both witnessed and felt in communal worship is the existential need to be in a community setting where the truth is spoken, where sacred text is honored for its wisdom, where strong, spirit-laden voices speak words of hope and encouragement from prophets and poets and philosophers and great thinkers. Earlier in the week when Jennifer and I were talking, we were noticing how easily and how often tears and sometimes outright weeping might occur during a service of worship. I have wondered about this. What's happening as I'm worshiping and the tears begin to flow? This has happened and it's been your experience. Maybe you wonder too, what's going on? And we tend, I think, at times to be a little embarrassed because we're afraid that someone else might think there's something wrong with us. As a people living with so much untruth and manipulated truth for so long, our spirits can become parched of truth. Our dried out sponge selves slurp up the luxury of spiritual food, and tears of gratitude and relief may spill over. Hearing truth and wisdom spoken with reverence in these turbulent times seems like water and manna in the desert. We may hear a word or a phrase that sparks a sudden insight, and a welling up of nameless energy spills over and is released in tears. However we understand the nature of our most essential selves, we have a need for authenticity, for reverence, for connection with eternal truth. And when we are in the presence of what our spirits crave, tears of utter gratitude and relief may flow abundantly. It is a profound and holy privilege to gather together for worship. Through our intentions, our rituals, our prayers, our singing together, our listening, a palpable and nameless something, the mystery, if you will, is set in motion that is larger than who we are, a holiness that binds us together, that heals us, that encourages us and gives us hope through everything. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his beautiful book titled Sabbath, wrote this: one of the most distinguished words in the Bible is kadosh, holy, a word which more than any other is representative of the mystery and the majesty of the divine. And he wrote this: now, what was the first holy object in the history of the world? Was it a mountain? Was it an altar? There is no reference in the record of creation to any object in space that would be endowed with the quality of holiness. When history began, there was only one holiness in the world: holiness in time. Time set apart for just being, for resting, for enjoying creation, for enjoying one another, for celebrating life in gratitude. This is what happens when we worship. We enter holiness in time, and our life and energy and hope and creativity for living are replenished and restored. May it always be so as we worship together. Amen. Thank you.